back up because one of the things that we're going to look at in Daniel 5 is you're going to see there's kind of a repetition here. You're back into a setting to where you've got you have a revealing of God Himself, God speaking again, or this time, God actually writing on a wall this time. And then you have the bringing in of various magicians and basically, the advisors and the counselors, those surrounding the king himself coming in, unable to interpret the sign, these kinds of things. And then lo and behold, guess what? Daniel comes, riding in again to be able to deliver the interpretation. So it seems like, man, this seems to happen a lot. Well, I think part of the two, though, is you got to remember, even though these are just one chapter to the next in our Bibles, this is also over a pretty significant span of time, right? Anybody remember when we were in Daniel chapter 1, what the approximate age of Daniel and his three friends were when they came over from Judea? Anybody remember?
16, 17.
Yeah, probably more, even closer to 13 or 14 years old. Yeah, they were extremely young. And so by the time that we get to chapter 5, Daniel is probably 79 or 80 years old. Okay. So this is, so a lot of years have passed by the time that we get to this point. So, and it's interesting when you go back and you look at Daniel 1 and then, really Daniel chapter 2, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had there, it was only, 2 or 3 years after the events that occurred in Daniel chapter 1, where Daniel refused to participate in the king's food because he wasn't going to acknowledge his sovereignty over him. So then, of course, Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of the statue that occurs about 3 years after that. Then roughly by the time in the fiery furnace incident, Nebuchadnezzar was about 29, 30 years old when he became king. And then so by the time you get to Daniel chapter 3, with the fiery furnace incident, Nebuchadnezzar is probably somewhere around 40 years old. Daniel's probably about 25 years old by that time frame when that happens. And then, of course, Daniel chapter 4, which was what we studied previously with Nebuchadnezzar's personal testimony and of God humbling him. Daniel's probably about 42-ish or so, 42, 43 years old. Nebuchadnezzar is about 60 years old. I'm sorry, about not mid-50s or so. So then by the time you get to this point, when we get to Daniel chapter 5, there's a couple of things that's important to remember. Daniel, like I said, is about 79 years old. And by this time, Nebuchadnezzar had been dead for like 23 years. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar died at the age of 72. And of course, as I mentioned to you, there's the last couple of decades, especially of Nebuchadnezzar's life. We don't have there's no really written evidence or anything about him. I mean, it's almost, it's like from the annals of history, from the Babylonian perspective, after Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by God, even though he was restored for a time frame, there's really nothing written about him as far as from a Babylonian historical perspective. So, which tells you a lot probably about his personal life and the reality of his conversion after that episode in Daniel chapter 4. So here you have an aged Daniel, 79, 80 years old. Nebuchadnezzar's been dead for 23 years. But what's interesting is you have what seems like a repetition of events that happen again, right? Again, I think it's just helpful for us to remember these things are not happening close together. These things are happening with significant years and distance apart. Right? So we're introduced in chapter 5. Let me just read verses 1 through 4. And there's going to be several things, even though there's some similarities, there's a bunch of differences as there are as well too. So chapter 5, verse 1, Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and the silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. And then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king, his nobles, his wives, and concubines drank from them, and they drank the wine and praised the gods of God, gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. let's just stop there for a second. So interesting. There's a lot of history that's happened, in the previous 40 years that, Daniel 5 just doesn't even cover, right? It just jumps straight into Belshazzar. Now, interestingly, it says Nebuchadnezzar, his father, but Nebuchadnezzar was not he was not Belshazzar was not a biological grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, who was, there was like three different kings that right after Nebuchadnezzar died, there were three kings that rose up, and they, first one, he was, I think they all three were eventually, they were killed. And so eventually Nebuchadnezzar came to power, and this is his son Belshazzar, who's king at this time frame. And I'll talk a little bit more about him in just a moment. But immediately though, you're faced with something here is that he has all of these nobles and stuff together. It says like 1,000 of them, and it kind of reminds us a little bit of Daniel chapter 3, right? Which was the image that was set up, the golden image that was set up, right? And of course, that was what we called, that was Nebuchadnezzar's his unity festival that he kind of threw, a big party he kind of threw in order to try to unite everybody, bring some kind of solidarity or some kind of adhesion behind all of those who were living in Babylon, right? Because he had multiple nations of people that were scattered across the empire, and trying to bring some kind of unity among that group. So you see Belshazzar here doing something in some ways where also all of his nobles, and these nobles are guys that are coming from all of these various regions that the Babylonian Empire consisted of. I mean, and you have to think, that Babylonian Empire went as far north as, even over to, modern day areas of Greece, through Iran, Iraq, all those places, even as far east over towards Afghanistan, those kind of places. It was a huge territory, okay, massive territory. And so you had all kinds of people there. So what's really interesting, though, is that from a historical perspective, there's a lot going on here. So let me try to explain as quick as I can. I don't spend a lot of time here, but I think having context is really important, because we kind of have to ask the question here: why? What is this thing even about? Why is he even having this kind of, this drunken, debaucherous kind of party that he's throwing here? And you can use your imagination when you have concubines and others and a lot of drinking that's going on. You can imagine sort of the activities that are taking place here, right? So here you have just sort of this drunken fest that's going on with all these political leaders. But here's what's going on in the background. This is what's really interesting. Nebuchadnezzar, his father, was only 50 miles away from the capital city, from Babylon, and had just suffered a major defeat by the Persian army. Okay, and you say, well, how'd this happen? Well, first of all, there was Nebuchadnezzar, his father, got into a conflict with the religious priesthood of Babylon. You guys may remember, I told you that the chief god for the Babylonians was a god named Marduk. Okay, the massive temple that was built, the ziggurat that was built, and everything was all for Marduk. I know, just hang with me for a second. But Nebuchadnezzar, though, actually was devoted to the moon god named Sin. So yeah, consequently, right? But the moon god named Sin. So as a result of that, he got into a major conflict with the ruling priestly class. You got to remember that these were, the religion and government was tied together in these contexts. And so in many ways, the conflict became so bitter that the priests actually, probably tried to have him removed from his kingship, removed from office. So he actually relocated to a different town, Timinus, which was to the west of this. And so he actually relocated to a whole different place. So you actually had the real king was actually in a different town, and then now his son Belshazzar is actually in the town, which is in Babylon itself. Which kind of makes sense later when we get to the part where Belshazzar says, "Whoever can interpret this dream, I'm going to make him third ruler." It kind of helps understand that, because Nebuchadnezzar was still a king. He was just living in a different spot. Belshazzar was actually the one inside Babylon. So you had this kind of thing that's going on. Well, here's what's crazy. 50 miles away from this, while this party is going on, Nebuchadnezzar had just been defeated by the Persians. And the Persians themselves actually were they were the rising new dominant political the new super political power that was actually emerging to the force emerging to the scene. So they were the new geopolitical power that was that was coming. And several things about that. It was you'll ever heard of the phrase the Medes and Persians, the Median Persians, right? You'll hear you'll hear that phrase, which is really interesting because Nebuchadnezzar's wife. You guys have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Okay, those were built for Nebuchadnezzar's wife, who was actually Median, and so it's kind of interesting. So then the Median, huh? Yeah. He was killed during that battle with the Persians. Yeah. So what's interesting about this is now he's having this show. I'm telling you all this because I want you to get a sense of the character of Belshazzar, because you're going to notice something in this chapter. Daniel's attitude towards Belshazzar is completely different than what it was towards Nebuchadnezzar. And you're going to see that when we get a little bit further on. But here you have a guy who knows his dad was just defeated by the Persians 50 miles away from here. The Persian army is coming. And what's he doing? He's throwing a party. Yeah. I mean, it just tells you a lot about the character of this guy. And on top of that, though, here you kind of see a lot of this kind of syncretism. It's kind of a party that's also a kind of an act of desperation. Because what is he doing? Not only is he having a party and he's brought all these nobles together, because ultimately he knows that war is coming. So what do? You pull everybody together and you're doing the same thing. You're trying to create unity, right? You want everybody to stand behind you as a political leader, so that way they'll go to war for you, okay? So on top of that, what's he also doing? What is the point about him with the temple articles and everything mentioned here about the idolatry that's going on? What else is he doing?
He is captive of it.
Okay, yeah. So his own domination. That comes up strong in verses 13 and following. Yeah. What else?
They're sacrificing to God.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it.
Yeah.
To get their God.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, here it's almost like worship one, worship all, whatever it takes, because there's a sense of desperation here. Does that make sense? So here, I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because despite all Nebuchadnezzar's faults, okay, everything he did wrong is right. The one thing he didn't do is he didn't desecrate the articles that came out of the temple. He actually put them in a separate storehouse and left them there, right? I mean, think about it. I mean, these things have not even been touched for over 50 years. They've been sitting in a storehouse, right? And all of a sudden, now Belshazzar grabs all these articles. I mean, these are all the utensils that were used by the priest of the temple, and he uses these now to, filling the goblets with wine, and then turns around and uses the same instruments that came out of the temple, out of the house of the Lord, and uses those instruments to sacrifice to false gods. Think about this. I mean, it's the most mind-blowing kind of circumstance that Daniel that we find in this scene right here. And of course, so how does he want to get unity? How does he want? Well, so you've got all these nobles, 1,000 nobles that are from all different territories, and guess what? There's as many gods as there is, territories that these nobles all came from, right? So what he's going to be pluralistic. We're gonna sacrifice to all the gods. We're going to appeal to everybody, right? I mean, you guys, we see this today, right? People have their ecumenical, events and stuff. We're gonna have the unity of all the faiths, because it's just one God and all the religions and all this other stuff, right? So you see, exactly. So he's doing a shotgun worship and hoping to hit one God in the part of this, right? That actually can help him out, right? Yeah, exactly. So we're gonna have a drunken worship fest in order to hope that get all the nobles drunk. You make them happy, have a big party. They're having a good time, and at the same time, we're going to have some worship here, so that way, hopefully, we get somebody's favor in all of this, and maybe we can actually be able to defeat the Persians. Very important, because remember what I described to you last time about the elaborate construction of the city of Babylon. city had 3 walls, and these were massive walls. Remember, I told you that Herodotus, the Greek historian, described that the outer ring of the wall of the city of Babylon was so wide that a 4-horse chariot could actually ride across the top of the wall. So in many ways, you had a river that was flowing through the city. You had what felt like was impenetrable defensive, walls and a fortress that was impenetrable. And so there's a lot of, so in many ways, there was an arrogant confidence, just an arrogance about Belshazzar that just oozes out of him that Daniel obviously has no patience for. We'll see that a little bit later. And so, in all the midst of this, in all of the midst of this party that's going on, you get to verse 5, and this is what's awesome. All of a sudden, suddenly, the finger of a man's hand emerged. Now that would be kind of freaky, wouldn't it? Imagine that, all of a sudden, but it's very, yeah, exactly. Everybody's kind of going, wow, it's really strong stuff, right? But hey, I want you to pay attention though to the way this is written. I want you to see how deliberate God was when he did this. This is so cool. Some fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite of the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Now, hang on. Did you notice some of the language that was used there? We'll tell you a little bit. First of all, let's say a little bit about this. From archaeological excavations and studies, what we have learned about the walls, like in Babylon and other ancient palaces like that, they had access to gypsum. And so just like, gypsum is used in drywall today, right? It's a gypsum board. But they had access to gypsum. And so what would often happen was they would take the walls and they would wipe them with gypsum. And that was a coating that they would actually use on the walls, right? Which turned them what color? Yeah, like a grayish, like white, okay? Which white is very reflective, okay? And on top of that, did you notice where he said where the hand emerged opposite of? The lampstand. Why is that significant? Yeah, it was not going to be missed. You see what I'm saying? It's like right where the lamp was at, where it could be. You had the the greatest illumination in the room. There's where the writing was at. So this was not something that was going to be missed. You got a white wall, you got a lampstand, and all of a sudden their hand mentions it, and all of a sudden everybody. I mean, it's clearly visible to everybody in that room. So I love the language here because it just shows us how intentional God is with this message. Verse 6, then the king's face grew pale, okay? Literally, Hebrew would say his face lost its blood. In other words, the blood just went from his face. He was completely pale. And I love look at this. His thoughts were alarmed. His hip joints went slack. And his knees began knocking together. This guy was terrified. Because, when the hand emerges like that, and writing something, this ain't going to be good. You know what I'm saying? This is, so he knows this is not going to be good. That's right. That's right.
The writing on the wall.
Exactly. That's where the phrase comes from. The handwriting is on the wall, right? Yeah. Very interesting, though, the fingers that emerge. There's several things, when you hear about the fingers of God, like what are the things that come to mind? Anybody? Anything come to mind when you talk about the fingers of God? 10 Commandments, yeah. Deuteronomy chapter 9, Exodus chapter 31. Moses is very, very deliberate in talking about how the tablets were penned by the finger of God, right? So very cool. Absolutely. So here you have this sort of, you have this description, just how, it always goes back to humanity created in His image, right? So you have this kind of this image characteristic. Also, what's very interesting too is Exodus chapter 9, I think too. You have remember Pharaoh's magicians that could never, they couldn't conquer, the God of Moses, right? And they finally, they got to one of those plagues, and they just said, "This is the work of the finger of God." It was so here once again we see the work of the finger of God at work again, and this is occurring now on the actual writing of the wall. So here, So here we go. Here's a familiar story, verse 7. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. Right? So he's got all the political officials, all of his astrologers, all of his advisors, his cabinet, okay, all are brought in. And he says to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me will be clothed in purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as a third ruler in the kingdom. That goes back to the comment I made to you about Nebuchadnezzar was still alive. He was still recognized as a king, and then Belshazzar was his son, right? Belshazzar was might have been a late teenager, maybe around the age of 20. Okay, to kind of give you an idea about his own age, which explains a lot about his own arrogance as well too. And so, verse 8, then all the king's wise men came in, but no surprise here, right? They could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. And the king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. So this time he's in panic mode, right? And his face had basically, the Hebrew would say, basically he has no blood in his face. I mean, this guy's like completely white, man. He is just about to faint because he's had such desperation. So what's interesting is you have a queen that enters. Now you have to understand something, that in the Old Testament, in fact, I would say that probably after, I mean, most of the time, anytime that there's a mention of a queen that enters into a scenario like this or a situation like this, it doesn't mean the wife of the king. So this is not Belshazzar's wife. It's probably his mother, or at least a mother from a predecessor. Okay, so you kind of have to understand this is like a queen's mother kind of a situation. This is an older lady, and that becomes apparent because of her own background story that she can give about Nebuchadnezzar, right? So it's very interesting because this actually, I do know there's a few Old Testament scholars I know that think this may be Nicodemus, which is actually Nebuchadnezzar's wife. And so this could be really interesting, but you can't really prove that. I don't know. But verse 10, the queen entered the banquet hall, okay, because of the words of the king and his nobles, and the queen said, "O king, live forever." You know, you gotta flatter this cocky jerk, right? So do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face grow pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of God found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. And this was because of extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams and explanation and enigmas and solving difficult problems were found in this. This is interesting. Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. It's very interesting. I mean, maybe not apparent immediately. She does reference his name as Belshazzar, but she's predominantly using what name? Daniel. Why is that significant? Why does that matter? Yeah, acknowledging what he is a Hebrew, okay, and not going by the name that was actually given to him by Nebuchadnezzar. It's almost like she, in many ways, it shows a level of respect that she has for him. You know what I'm saying? Because one of the things this chapter is going to do for us is help us to contrast the respect that she has for Daniel, and then just sort of the disrespect that Belshazzar has towards Daniel, because his conversation with Daniel is just completely disrespectful. And so here you have, so this queen, whether it's Nicodemus and it's actually Nebuchadnezzar's wife, no one really knows. We do know she's older. She's been around. She understands. She knows what's happened. She's got respect for Daniel, makes this appeal, uses his Hebrew name here, shows a lot of affection for Daniel and appreciation for him. So that stands in complete contrast to what we're going to read down in verse 13. So Daniel was brought in before the king. So, gave Daniel some time. He's 80 years old. Yeah, took him a little bit of time. Had to use his electric scooter to get over there. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel?" Listen to what this guy talks, right? "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" Is that? So there's your first comment to the guy. So why is he making a big deal that you're one of the exiles from Judah? Why is that a big deal for him? Okay, that's right. Let's make sure we understand who's who here, right? I'm the king. You're the one conquered, right? Yeah. So you get this sense of kind of just again, it's just dripping with arrogance here, right? So he's kind of being disrespectful. Verse 14. Now I have heard about you. That a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination and insight and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now, the wise men, the conjurers, were brought in before me that I read this inscription and make the interpretation unto me. They could not declare the interpretation or the message. But I personally have heard about you. What's interesting about that? I've heard. What's interesting about that is the contrast to Nebuchadnezzar, who would tell Daniel, "I know a spirit of the holy gods is in you." Despite how wrong that is, Nebuchadnezzar was at least respectful to recognize he knew something unique about Daniel. Belshazzar was an arrogant guy. He's like, "Well, I've heard that you could do that. I've heard this about you." You kind of get that sort of insolence that he has that comes out of him, right? And so, verse 16, I personally have heard about you that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you'll be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you'll have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. What's interesting about what this guy doesn't realize is that Daniel's kind of like been there, done that, right? In many ways. So, obviously not Daniel, but yeah, Belshazzar, yeah. But here's what's interesting is, look, if you can have a little bit of imagination here, it kind of makes you wonder, what Daniel's been doing for 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, because I'm sure that life changed for him. And then when Nebuchadnezzar came to power, the other kings died. Belshazzar, this young punk, he's now sitting in this seat and whatnot. It's kind of difficult to imagine maybe where Daniel's been, kind of how life has been for him. Here's one thing that's very important, though, for you guys to recognize here. This is the end of Daniel's life. When we get to chapters 7 through 12, those visions that Daniel has, okay, those all happen before this event. Okay, so what you have is in the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel is you have a lot of narrative of kind of what the major episodes and events of what happened during Daniel's ministry in his time in Babylon. But the visions that he has in chapters 7 through 12 actually all occur before this event here. Okay, so that's important to remember. Okay, because here's something that is important for us. Flip over to just chapter 8. Look in chapter 8 for just a moment, okay? Same book of Daniel. Daniel said, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king. So you notice who the king was, right? We had this vision, okay? In the 3rd year of his reign, Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one that appeared to me previously. That's in chapter 7. We'll talk about that when we get there. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision and found myself by the Ulai River or canal. I lifted my eyes, I looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in the front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, one was longer than the other, and one was coming, and with the other coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, southward. No other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue him from his power, but he did as he pleased, right? And you flip over at the end here to go to verse 15. Verse 15, when I, Daniel, saw the vision, tried to understand it, behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Eli, and he called out, saying, Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. So he came to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now, while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. He touched me and made me stand upright and said, behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of indignation, for it pertains to the appointment of the time of the end. Verse 20, the ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of what? Media and Persia, right? So this is interesting, because all of a sudden what we're learning here is that in the 3rd year that Belshazzar was actually sitting there and acting as king in Babylon, Daniel had already had a vision And what was the vision? This vision, he was going down, right? I mean, so in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel already knew what was happening. This had already been foretold, right? So he knew what was coming, right? And here's what's crazy. Who was it that I told you had just conquered his father, Nebuchadnezzar, 50 miles away? Persia. He knew all this was happening. So, which kind of explains, so here you have Belshazzar, okay, back in chapter 5. Belshazzar saying, look, if you can describe this inscription for me, I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you all of, the emblems of authority and power, make you third ruler of the kingdom, do all this stuff for you, right? Verse 17, look at Daniel's response. And Daniel answered the king and said, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I'll read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Daniel didn't seem like he was too impressed with what was the reward offering, was he? Why? Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Well, ultimately, he knew Belshazzar had nothing to give, right? I mean, Daniel already knew. I mean, God already spoken to him. He knew what was coming, and guess what? He did too. This is an act of desperation. Daniel knew he had nothing to give, This guy, Daniel has no respect for this guy because it just shows the insolence, just his arrogance in this regard. And what's interesting, this is not the only place this was spoken about. Do you guys remember other places where Persia was prophesied? Huh? Isaiah, big time, absolutely. In fact, hold your place here. Just turn back to Isaiah 44 real quick, man. It's worth visiting there. Okay. So you're talking what, 700? So we're talking roughly, Isaiah's prophecy here is roughly 120 years before this event. No, I'm sorry. 540. Well, sorry, I'm doing math in my head here. So probably, let's say 160 years. So let's say 160 to 165 years before the Persians arrive at the gates of Babylon, Isaiah's writing here. Okay, so this is a very, very important chapter here. So Isaiah 40, 44, right? Yeah, well, let's start back at the end of verse 44 real quick. Yeah, because it's mentioned twice. So check this out, okay? Remember I told you one time before, right? The biggest concern that the Judeans faced whenever they were in exile was the biggest question they all faced was that when Jerusalem was conquered and they were exiled to Babylon, the question for everybody was, has God given up on us? Has God revoked his covenant? Does God even care for us anymore? This was a huge ministry that Jeremiah had, as well as Ezekiel. Ezekiel's entire ministry, because remember, I told you Jeremiah was actually having to prophesy while he was in Jerusalem. Daniel was in Babylon, but then Ezekiel was also in Babylon, but he was with the actual exiles. And the biggest question that everybody's trying to answer is that we know that we've been judged. Has God given up on us, right? So here you have this. So even 160 years before this, you've got Isaiah who's prophesying something here and saying in Isaiah 44, verse 21, remember these things, O Jacob, Israel, for you are my servant. I have formed you. You are my servant, O Israel. You will not be what? You will not be forgotten by me. That's a huge promise, isn't it? So here you've got Isaiah. By this time, he's 120 years ahead of time, letting them know, look, you're going to be judged, you're going to be exiled, God's going to deal with you. But in the end, just remember, you're not going to be forgotten by me. Okay? So that's a huge promise, right? So you see this in verse 24. Thus said the Lord your Redeemer, and the one who formed you from the womb. I, the Lord, and the maker of all things, stretching out the heavens by myself, spreading out all of the earth all alone, causing the omens of boasters to fail, making fools out of diviners. I mean, that's what he did to Belshazzar's guys, right? Causing wise men to draw back, turning their knowledge into foolishness, confirming the word of his servant, performing the purpose of his messengers. It is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and the cities of Judah, they will be built, and I will raise up her ruins again. It is I who says to the depth of the sea, be dried up. I will make your rivers dry. It is I who says of who? Cyrus. He is my shepherd. We'll come back to that. He will perform all my desire. When he declares of Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and in the temple your foundation will be laid. Verse 4, and then chapter 45, thus says the Lord to Cyrus. Remember, this is 180 years beforehand, guys. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, to loose the loins of the kings, to open the doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you, make the rough places smooth. I'll shatter the doors of bronze, cut through the iron bars. I'll give you the treasures of darkness and the hidden wealth of secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by name, for the sake of Jacob, my servant, Israel, my chosen one. I have called you by your name, giving you a title of honor, though you have not known me. Check that out. 180 years beforehand, God is declaring that, you know what? Israel, Judah will be judged. But the Lord is not going to forget them. And not only is he not going to forget them, just to prove his point, because remember, and what's really interesting about Isaiah chapter 44 is that in the early part of the chapter, Isaiah was picking on people who were idol worshipers. And because the one thing that Isaiah says, he says, you know what? I'll tell you what, you think your gods are real? I'll tell you this. Let's see who can predict the future. The real test about who a God is, a God's real power, or whether or not he's impotent here, is whether or not he can predict the future. Isaiah declares the future with such specific precision and detail to where it completely nullifies and shows the impotence of all the other gods that people were worshiping. And with such detail, he names 180 years beforehand a Persian king named Cyrus. Now, everybody who heard Isaiah's message was like, Cyrus, who is that? You know? Nobody knows who Cyrus is. Yeah. You know, it's like ignorant. Huh? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Billy Ray? Is that right? Anyway, so nobody has a clue who Cyrus is, but 180 years before, Isaiah is announcing this name to prove something that the Lord is not going to give up on his people. But then on top of that, he calls him what? His anointed. And then on top of that, he calls him what? His shepherd. Because why? Because he's like a shepherd. He's going to use a pagan king to shepherd his people out of Babylon, okay, out of modern day Iraq, and bring them all the way back to their homeland, back in Judea. And so he's announcing this well ahead of time. So you have that, other places in Jeremiah 51. I encourage you to read Jeremiah 51. We don't have time to do it this morning. But there's already so much information that's already out there that Babylon was a temporary kingdom that God established for the chastisement, for the punishment of his people, for his people Israel, for the Judeans, because of their idolatry. Right? This is what we studied about when we studied Ezekiel. But then the Lord says, once I'm done with you, it's over. And the Lord, remember what Isaiah said as well? That he was going to, remember how I told you that Belshazzar kind of felt like that they were in a massive fortress in Babylon, right? Three walls. Who's going to be able to scale these walls? Who's going to be able to, by the way, to give you a sense of a picture of this, archaeologists discovered some of the outer walls and some of the gates. Some of the gates of the outer walls in Babylon were over 40 feet tall. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I mean, even from our standards today, okay? Over 40 feet. And all of a sudden you have Isaiah, and God says, oh, by the way, I'm going to cut the iron bars for you. I'm going to break the gates down for you. I mean, you have the Lord who's saying, anything that raises up against you, I'm going to level it. And any kind of obstacle you face, I'm going to destroy it. He's going to allow Persia to basically walk right in. So he's going to ask this 180 years ahead of time. Well, there you go. That's right. I knew Biden would come in here soon. So he shows up. So verse 17, okay? So verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or your rewards to someone else. However, I'll read the inscription free of charge. I don't even charge anything for this. How about that? Verse 18, O King, the Most High God, grant sovereignty. Now listen to his rebuke, man. This is classic. I love this. He said, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples and the nations and people of every language, they all feared and they trembled before him. And whomever he wished, he killed. Whomever he wished, he spared alive. Whomever he wished, he elevated. And whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was stripped away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of a wild animal, like a beast, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. And while he was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is the ruler over the realm of mankind, and he sets it over whomever he wishes. Remember, that was the lesson. Remember, in chapter 4, verse 26, that Nebuchadnezzar was going to learn that heaven rules, not him. So look at this, verse 22. Yet you Belshazzar, 4 things, ready? 4 things he accuses him of. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, you haven't humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. You hear that? So it's interesting. It's very interesting to me that when the queen comes in, okay, when the mother comes in, ultimately she's reminding him of history that he already knew. But isn't that interesting, though, how we can become forgetful in our sin and forgetful in our pride, right? And so here, but this was, hey guys, by the way, it's very rare that we sin in ignorance. Okay, it's very rare that we sin and we don't know that we haven't sinned. Okay, the problem is that we kind of like, in our own pride, in our own arrogance, in our own, self-confidence, all those things and whatnot, there's like a callus that can develop over our heart to where we just kind of don't, we just don't want to acknowledge it, right? This is not something that Belshazzar did not know. He says, you knew this story about Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 23, but you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. You brought in the vessels of his house before you, you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines, and you've been drinking wine from them, and you've praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see, nor do they hear or even understand. But God, in whose hand are all your life breath and all of your ways, you have not glorified. So verse 24, and then the hand was sent from him, and the inscription was written out. Now, this is the inscription that was written out. Mani, Mani, Tekel, Ucharin. And this is the interpretation. Mani, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales, and you've been found wanting or deficient. Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Now, here's what's interesting. The reason why they couldn't read the inscriptions is because it was actually written, it was units of money. It was actually written as nouns. Mina, shekel, or tekel is actually from the word, you guys know these words. Remember, think about the New Testament. Jesus talks about the parable of the minas. You guys have heard that? That's the word. This is mina, okay? Tekel is an alternative word form of the word shekel, okay? Okay, and then you have the word basically, peres, which actually means half, which is like 50 cents. It's half a shekel, okay? So really, what's interesting is these 3 words were units of money. But Daniel turns around and puts them into verbs. Mina, your kingdom has been numbered, okay? Shekel, it's been weighed. And then it's been divided, okay? So essentially, so let me wrap up here. So essentially, he delivers this and takes these units of money that were delivered. Nobody has a clue what they mean, what is going on, but just didn't know it. Knew it didn't mean something very good, right? And then all of a sudden, Daniel gives the interpretation and says, "Yep, it's all about money. You've been numbered, you've been weighed, and now you're going to be divided. It's over." And so we'll see his response next week, which is kind of interesting. But man, it's a, this is why. Listen, our confidence always, guys, always remember when we study the book of Daniel and these things, even when life is like this, and even if we face we encounter people who are arrogant and people maybe who want to belittle us and people who want to undermine us because of our faith, or whether we're caught in a situation of living as strangers in a strange land and facing difficulties or whatever those things may be. The thing that we have learned from the book of Daniel is that in all of this, who's been in control? Every bit of it, man. Even in the harshest moments of this exile and the difficulties that they have all faced, man, God has been in absolute control of all this. And which is why I said our worship of the Lord cannot be based upon our circumstances. He has a plan, and the circumstances of our life does not dictate our responsibility of worshiping and following Him. God has been in control of this entire situation, and our faith can't rest on circumstances that we face. There is no plan B. There's always been a plan A, and it's being fully executed. So, hey, we'll look at response next week, and that rolls us right into chapter 6 as well too. But yeah, I do encourage you to go back and read Jeremiah 51 as well. I think you guys will be very. I think you'll find that very interesting too. What Jeremiah's words were as well. So, all right. Sorry, I went a little bit over. Let's pray. Father, thank you for reminding us once again, Lord, that you are in control of all history. There's not a king, political leader. There's not a business leader. There's not any occupation, any job, any position, anyone anywhere, Lord, is above your sovereignty. You are in control of all. Father, help us to remember that, Lord, whether our health is failing, whether life is difficult, whether, Lord, no matter what circumstances we may be faced with at any particular moment, Lord, help us to remember there is, as our brother said, there is no plan B. God, your will is being accomplished. And help us, Lord, to remember that. And help us to remember, Lord, at the end of the day, that kingdom, that rock that was carved out without human hands, smash and destroy all rival powers, gods, kingdoms, and entities that raise their head against you. Lord, you will establish the kingdom, Lord Jesus, in completeness, in fullness, in glory, and in power. And so, Lord, help us as men of God to remember these things. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
That was a mouthful. Good.